We'll wait another minute before we get started. So that one of the awkward things of streaming about around this time is that this about now is like the perfect time to take like an afternoon nap. You know what I mean? Maybe that's what some people are doing right now on a nice sunny day like this. You can't really see it behind me, but it is actually nice outside right now. I mean, it's weird to think that like it's nice weather at the end of October, right? Where otherwise it would be, you know, pouring rain and cold, super cold. But it's actually not that today. So I'm sure a lot of people are out savoring them, savoring the nice weather in October before it gets super dreary. I mean, November. Can you believe November is already coming around? Like Monday, it's November 1st, right? And it's already weird to think. Like more or less, 2021 is basically at an end. So weird to think that. I mean, it's always weird to think that every year, you know, when you get around to the like end of October / early November of any year, it just feels weird, right? It's just oh, excuse me, it is just a weird thing. But anyway, hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Kings. And today we're just gonna read through 4 chapters. Not gonna be on too long today. We're gonna read through 4 chapters. We're gonna read through 2 Kings, chapters 5 to 8, however long that takes me. It might not even take me an hour. I mean, it depends on like how long my notes actually take me, because I don't actually have that many notes for this either. Because basically, these next few chapters are just kind of like events that happen, right? So this guy was king and did that. That other dude was king and did that, and it does that whole back and forth between like, well, this king in Judah was like this, and meanwhile in Israel we had this king do this and that, right? And so there's not a lot of theological things to really talk about, and not really a lot of interesting narrative things to talk about either. So even though like technically these Bible reads are supposed to be more educational, excuse me, it's hard to be educational in like pretty straightforward chapters. Like these are the chapters you just read at face value, right? So I don't feel like I have a lot of commentary on these next couple of chapters. So this stream might not even be that long. But regardless, if you showed up, I'm glad that you did for this shorter stream. We're going to start us off with a word of prayer. If you want to follow along, I am using the New International Version, and we are starting on 2 Kings chapter 5. Let's just bow our heads for a quick moment. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word, and I just pray that even in straightforward, boring chapters like this, you would reveal yourself to us, and that we would be drawn closer to you. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Alright, so, like I already said, these chapters, there's really not a lot going on. You just hear, like, some kind of... it's not even like an epic war story either. It's just like some events that happen, during these kings' reigns. And they're not even, like... They're just kind of... The Bible just kind of, I guess, wanted to tell you this, but it doesn't really have much of a point to it, really. Not in the grand scheme of things, right? Like, I guess the only thing that's noteworthy, and I will point them out when we get there, is like, oh yeah, Elisha is doing stuff, right? And more of like, okay, compare him to Elijah, right? Like, Elisha does more stuff. And that's all you really see here, right? Is that Elisha's doing some stuff, right? And so that's basically all I have to say about these next set of chapters. But we're going to start in chapter 5. So here we go. Chapter 5. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master, and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now the band of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. So she said to her mistress, oh God, I gotta do a woman's voice while having a sore throat. If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. But, by all means, go, the king of Aram replied. I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing, which is actually quite a bit of money, but we'll cover that in a bit. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, with this letter I am sending you my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, Am I God? Can I kill and bring back life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me? So when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him a message. Why have you torn your clothes? Have the men come up to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Now Elisha sent a messenger to him. Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. But Naaman was very angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Parthpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he went off in a rage. Now Naaman's servant went to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he tells you, Wash and be cleansed? So Naaman went and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant. And the prophet answered, As surely as the Lord lives, who I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. If you will not, said Naaman, please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. Go in peace, Elisha said. Now after Naaman had traveled some distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he had brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So Gehazi hurried after Naaman. When Naaman saw him running toward him, he got down from the chariot to meet him. Is everything all right? He asked. Everything is all right, Gehazi answered. My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets had just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothes. By all means, take 2 talents, said Naaman. He urged Gehazi to accept them, and then tied up the 2 talents of silver in twin bags with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead to Gehazi. When Gehazi came to the hill, he took the things from the servants and put them away in the house. He sent the men away, and they left. Now when he went and stood before his master, Elisha asked him, Where have you been, Gehazi? Sorry, I should have changed the name pronunciation because I'm doing a voice. Let me try that again. Where have you been, Gehazi? Your servant didn't go anywhere, Gehazi answered. But Elisha said to him, Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money, or to accept clothes, or olive groves and vineyards, or flocks and herds, or male and female servants? Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever. Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. So, chapter 5. We just get this weird story about this guy from, like, one of the far-off tribes, little, like, warring clans, I guess, nearby Israel, and would have been a natural enemy to Israel, actually, the Arameans. And we just get this story about this general, right, Naaman, and how he is, given a miracle from Elisha. And that's really the bulk of the story, and there's that little part at the end where Elisha's own servants, they are consumed by greed, and so they try to accept a reward, even though Elisha told Naaman that one wasn't necessary for the healing. And then this Gehazi guy gets a little greedy, right? Because it's one of the funny things where like, what kind of king? You got to think about the Aramean king for a moment, right? Excuse me. I don't know. I'm coughing so much today, more than usual. But anyway, so name the king of Aram. He seems like a really stand-up, like generous king because like he's willing to spend a ridiculous amount of money for his one like servant. I assume is like a general of his army, right? And so what does he give? He gives like 10, what is it, 10 talents of silver? Let me see that again. It's like 10 talents of silver or something ridiculous like that. A talent was about like 700 pounds of like of a resource. So when it says like 10 talents of silver, that would be like 7,000. Yeah, 7,000 pounds of silver. Which is quite a bit, right? I mean, I'm sure some metallurgist will tell me, how much a silver coin would have weighed. But imagine like you have these silver coins, which was their currency, and then you have like 7,000 pounds of it, right? Now a single coin probably doesn't weigh very much. Probably weighs like a few ounces, half an ounce at most, right? To my knowledge, silver isn't all that heavy. So if you had 7,000 pounds of this stuff, that would be like a lot of silver. For like what? Healing one guy? Like this king just goes all out on it, right? For Naaman's betterment. Of course, like back then, leprosy was a big deal. Like leprosy is not a big deal nowadays, right? Because, it's pretty easily curable. Whereas like back then, of course, they don't have medicine like we do now. I mean, thank God for modern medicine. But like, they didn't have the kind of medicine we do now. So leprosy was something that people would have for like basically life. And of course, leprosy, it would if you had leprosy, it's like your skin is always itching. That's kind of nasty, right? And then of course it makes you like unappealing because you got like if you have leprosy, you're prone to a lot of other stuff. That's the funny thing about like leprosy as an illness is that leprosy itself is not like the deadliest thing, right? It's not like a super deadly disease. However, if more often than not, it's like if you had leprosy, then you're more likely to have like all these other things that were deadly, right? It's similar to like I'm trying to think of like when people have weakened immune systems because of like drug use. Not the best correlation, I know, but like you think of people that like have okay, so here I'll use a better example. So people who contract, like HIV, right? Sure, HIV is pretty deadly, but then what makes it worse is that you contract everything, right? And that's why if people were HIV positive, other people avoid them like the plague, right? Because not only are they carrying, sexually transmitted infections, they're definitely carrying all kinds of other stuff. AIDS being one of them, carrying, more likely to spread flus and stuff like that. There was actually a study recently that people with HIV are more likely to carry COVID. And even if a person with HIV was vaccinated, they're more likely to be carriers of COVID. And so it's one of those things that like if you have an illness that's like a long-term illness, that's why I use HIV. It's not the best parallel, but HIV is like a long-term illness, just like leprosy in that sense. The only difference is HIV is, to our knowledge, not curable. But if you have a long-term illness like, HIV, you're more likely to be carrying all this other stuff. And if people know you have HIV, they're aware of this, and that's why they avoid you, right? They avoid you because, like, oh, who knows what else you could be carrying? Because of course HIV can only be transmitted, via blood transfusion or sexual contact. But so that part is less likely to spread, right? HIV is not as likely to spread. However, other diseases and illnesses that a person with HIV can carry that can be easily like transmitted, using COVID as an example, you know, that's why people would quickly avoid people who had HIV. It's kind of the same thing with leprosy, though obviously not to the same. I mean, it depends on how you look at it, right? Because once again, in today's world and our modern medicine, since leprosy is curable, or at the very least, very easy preventable, it is. I believe it is in fact curable through like all kinds of treatment. For those of you who don't know what leprosy is basically like a flesh eating disease, basically. But also, you have to remember back then it was harder. Hygiene was a lot more difficult, one. And two, when you think of like Bible stories and like the place where they are, right? These arid places that, flowing water is not something that's plentiful, right? When because of the lower level of hygiene, leprosy was more common. And so people would get like various infections on their skin, and then that could cause leprosy and stuff like that, which nowadays would be very, very unlikely to happen, right? You wouldn't just get like an infection on your skin and that'd be it, right? Unless, you got like Lyme disease from a tick or something, but that's completely different. Although I should have used Lyme disease as a better parallel to leprosy, actually, because Lyme disease is one of those things where, like, if you have it, it's not super deadly, but it makes you easily contract other stuff, which could kill you, right? So that's the tricky thing about like some of these diseases that you don't hear as much of. Like, I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't hear about like leprosy cases because, like, once again, leprosy is pretty easily preventable and just as easily curable, right? So it's it's not a big deal, right? But in the ancient world, it's completely different, right? Because our modern um, medication techniques and stuff like that don't exist back then. So with that said, though, you think of like even when they tried cleansing rituals, and this is one of the funny things where like when Elisha tells Naaman to like basically go dip yourself in like the Jordan 7 times and you'll be fine, right? And Naaman rightfully thinks like, wouldn't I just take a bath back home? Why would I come all this way just for you to tell me to take a bath? Not like I haven't tried that to get rid of leprosy, because once again, leprosy is a flesh-eating disease. Once you have it, it's not as easy to wash off because it kind of gets like a little more than skin deep, and that's why when you think of like when people have leprosy, that's why they become so ugly looking, right? Because like the leprosy goes like a little more than skin deep, and then it like really messes up your inner skin, right? And that's why people tend to look pretty nasty when they have leprosy. Which would have sucked for Naaman, right? Like he probably would have looked pretty ugly because of it. Because if he's had leprosy for a while, right, and the Bible implies that he does. But of course the Bible then tells us that like he was restored to the point that he looked like a young person, which I guess that's where the Bible kind of implies he had it for a while, and that Naaman himself actually isn't old. Like, I would have guessed that Naaman would probably be like around my age kind of thing. Like, he'd be like in his early 30s kind of thing, right? So he'd be like pretty regular looking 30-year-old guy, but then the leprosy, made him probably look like he's super old, right? Because once again, you have a flesh eating disease that's messing up what you look like, and you're like super pale and stuff all the time. It's not a pretty sight. But the Bible then tells us that, oh yeah, he was like I guess God gave him a little bonus. He wasn't just like cleaned up of the leprosy, but like I guess like some kind of spa. You know what? Like one of those like special like fountain of youth kind of like restorations of like skin and stuff. You think of like in those movies where like people go to those, they do like all that skin treatment. Like I assume Naaman probably got like the equivalent of that in like a split instant, right? Where like God miraculously does it. It's just excuse me. It's just funny to think because like the Bible tries to make this huge contrast between like Naaman looking kind of nasty with the leprosy, and then when he's healed from it, he looks like he's youthful, right? And so, despite the fact that he may not be, right? Because if he's a renowned general, he's obviously not just a kid, right? Or a young adult. He's probably an even older person in order to be a general, right? But yet, God gives him like this super youthful look. It's just interesting that the Bible would portray it this way. Then finally, we have this whole bit with Elisha's servant Gehazi, and Gehazi gets a little greedy, because I guess he wasn't a fan of like the monastic life, because I assume that like Elisha and his school, if you will, where these servants would be living, they probably lived a more monastic life, right? And the funny thing is that like, okay, so Naaman shows up and he's got like tons of cash, right? Like once again, we talked about the 10 talents of silver, tons of cash. And Elisha's like, nah, we don't really need that, right? We don't need to be paid for a simple service. quote unquote simple service, right? The healing of one man. But Gehazi he probably gets a little greedy because he's like, man, it sucks not having spending money, right? Because it's one of those things with like the monastic life, right? Where these guys just kind of do the whole like, think of like those like Tibetan monks stereotypes, right? They just kind of live out like hermits in a mountain, right? And that's kind of what Elisha and his guys are doing, right? And that's not an exclusively, or let me put it this way: most religions practice this kind of thing, right? The monastic lifestyle, because the idea behind it is that like, you know, you don't have to be so overly connected to the physical world, right? So you don't have to live like lavishly, and not be materialistic. And so that's why the monastic, you know, lifestyles exist. But it's not for everybody, and I wouldn't say like, you know, oh, every Christian should live monastically. I mean, I would be a hypocrite of that, wouldn't I, with my expensive ass computer and stuff like that, right? But of course, for some people that's not as easy a thing, right? And we see that it does. For some people, the materialism temptations are a lot stronger, right? Some people really like they have to, be able to live more lavishly in there, and it's one of those things that like it's kind of tough to like really talk about because like on the one hand, you know, every person needs to learn and find where they're content and not be like demanding of more all the time. But on the other hand, it's like we as human beings just naturally strive to have more, right? That's why you think of like why capitalism basically exists, right? Of course, once again, the moral failing of some people within the system is that, for some people it's never enough, right? So the thing that you're basically, weighing against each other is one, people can be happy with whatever level of stuff they have, right? And for some people is obviously different than others. But of course, you have to weigh that against, okay, when is it enough, right? because obviously as human beings we don't have an infinite pool of desire, right? And if you think you can try and feed, this infinite pool of desire in your life, you're gonna run into some pretty problematic places, right? And the overindulgence can be pretty deadly. And so it's one of those weird things to think about, because like on the one hand, what I'm trying to get at is you don't have to live like the monastic way, right? That's not like a requirement for spiritual living, right? Because I know many of people who live, more lavishly, but they're also, very generous with their money. They're also like, people who serve God and don't put their money first, kind of thing. You know, they don't worship their money, basically. And I know it's one of those funny things where it's like, well, of course, like some people may think, well, nobody worships money, which I would say that you're dead wrong if you think that, because there's a lot of people who do, right? But it's one of those weird things where like I don't really know what to say about like the monastic living, right? Because I can't really push for it if I myself would not be the type to live that way, right? You think of like, and that's the other thing that makes it difficult, and we should be honest about this in like the 21st century, where the monastic life seems very unattractive, right? Like I'm too used to certain like pleasantries in like living in Canada, for example, right? I couldn't go off and live in like some cabin, you know, in the mountain. You wouldn't catch me dead doing that, right? Like you would no way, no way, right? I like to be able to like be in the city, eat in all these nice places, right? Because I love eating out and I love going to all these different places, right? Definitely not a monastic lifestyle there. I like having, you know, a powerful computer and to be able to play video games, right? Couldn't do that in a monastic lifestyle, right? So it, it it would be really difficult as a 21st century citizen to like, okay, the monastic lifestyle seems attractive, right? Because I could not tell you in like sincerity that like, oh yeah, monastic life would be great. Like no, I couldn't tell you that sincerely, right? But at the same time, like the problem Gehazi has is that like he doesn't respect Elisha's orders, right? Because I assume that Elisha would have been like, okay, the word, the my word is that we're not taking money from this guy. We don't have to, right? Our life here is fine the way it is. Nobody bothers us and stuff like that. We have a peaceful life up here and all that. And so when Elisha shuts down um, Naaman for the money offering, you have to be like, okay, right? No is no. But Gehazi tries to like, do like a little take backsies, right? And say like, actually, the master does say he wants a little bit of money or whatever, even though that's a lie. And of course, there's the lying aspect too, right? So that could have been that could be the real reason why he's punished, as opposed to like wanting money, right? Because that's the other thing too in a lot of Bible stories, not just this one, but in a lot of Bible stories where like, where some people take more money than they should. It's not about the money itself, but rather when people are deceptive, right? They lie about it, or sometimes they do things that are worse than that just to have more money, right? Or to have more of anything, more material in general. Because that's the other thing too that many people misunderstand is like it's not like God is against people having material prosperity, right? God is not against that at all. As a matter of fact, there's sometimes where he blesses people with material goods, right? That would be contradictory, right? If God was against material, you know, accumulation, but then he would also bless people in that way, right? So God's not obviously against like having stuff and having more money, right? But what God is against is when when people make themselves crooked just to have more, right? So you think of in Gehazi lying to get money. You think of like King David, who commits murder to have more wives, right? in the New Testament, there's a couple that lies about money, and then God basically like kills them, right? Because they lie about money, and they also use the lie about money to try and make themselves look good, right? To make themselves look pious, right? And stuff like that. So it's not about the money itself, because in that same story, this is the book of Acts, Acts 5, by the way, that I'm referencing. In Acts 5, there's a story where there's this couple, right? And they sell like their property and they make all this money from it. And then what they connive to they connive this plan to basically give like half of the money and say like, oh, this is all our money, and by giving as much as they are is to make them look good, and then by lying by saying that like, oh, we're giving all our money is to make them look like they're really pious people by giving everything to God, kind of thing, right? And then Peter goes like, yo, what the hell, man? Like, why'd you lie to us, right? And why'd you lie to God, kind of thing, that you're, saying that this is all you have. And then there's an interesting line Peter has in that story where he says like, well, when the land was yours, right, it was yours to do what you wish, and it was fine, right? Nobody would have, God would have been cool with that. You can do what you want with your land, right? Which is a very capitalist mindset, by the way. Peter's like, when the land was yours, it was yours to do what you wish. When the money was yours, it was yours to do as you wish. But by coming here and lying to us and trying to deceive God, like that was where you committed evil, right? And so once again, it's not about the material goods themselves that are bad, right? It's when people try to use it to glorify themselves or to give themselves something that they shouldn't need, right? No, that's not a good way of wording it. In the case of the Acts story, it was, Ananias and Sapphira were trying to make themselves look way better than they actually were. In this story, Gehazi gets a little greedy, right? And so he lies to get money. And that's the lying part that God has a problem with, just like in the book of Acts story. It's the lying God has a problem with, not the acquiring more money. Because, I kind of do like, if I were to think like a what if, like maybe if at the start, if Gehazi was next to Elisha and then asked like, hey, couldn't we get a little bit of money? And then Elisha could have like, been a little lenient and be like, okay, we can take like a little bit. If he just asked, right, then maybe things could have been differently. Things could have gone differently. There was that clear communication and asking, right? And then God would have been like, no problem, right? Because once again, it's not the material things that God has a problem with, but it's because like Gehazi does this, he deceives Naaman, and Naaman's he basically gets conned, right, a little bit. Because I mean, to be fair, Naaman had the wealth, but that's besides the point. It's the fact that he gets conned, right, and God isn't happy with that. But that's the real crime here, right? It's not so much like the material wealth itself. And then of course, the Elisha does that whole like he uses like the power of God to like put a curse on someone again, which it does happen from time to time. I know there are like unpopular parts of the Bible where like God allows his prophets to put curses on people, right? But Elisha does that a couple of times, right? He puts a curse on Gehazi and says like, well, because you did this wicked thing, you will now have like the leprosy in your family. Which, yeah, that sucks. And that's really it about chapter 5. So let's move on. I talked about chapter 5 enough. Chapter 6. The company of the prophets said to Elisha, look, the place where we meet with you is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, where each of us can get a pole and let us build a place for us to meet." And Elisha said, "Go." Then one of them said, "Won't you please come with your servants?" "I will," Elisha replied, and he went with them. So they went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. As one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. "Oh no, my lord," he cried, "it was borrowed." Then the man of God asked, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it there, and made the iron float. "Lift it out," he said. Then the man reached his hand and took it. Now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, "I will set up my camp in such and such a place." The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, "Beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going there." So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. Now this enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, "Tell me, which one of us is on the side of the king of Israel?" "None of us, my lord the king," said one of his officers. "But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom." "Go and find out where he is," the king ordered, "so I can send men and capture him." The report came back that he is in Dothan. Then the king sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, an army of horses and chariots had surrounded the city. "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" the servant asked. "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are... Sorry. Verse 16. "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Strike this army with blindness." So he struck them with blindness, as Elisha had asked. And Elisha told them, "This is not the road, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for." And he led them to Samaria. After they entered the city, Elisha said, "Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see." Then the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them? Shall I kill them?" "Do not kill them," he answered. "Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them, so that they may eat and drink, and then go back to their master." So he prepared a great feast for them, and after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. That's one way to stop fighting, right? magically lead people to a place, give them a nice warm meal, and then say, "Look, aren't we friends?" And then we, you know, never have to fight ever again. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Verse 24. So sometime later, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army and marched up, and laid siege to Samaria. Now there was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. As the king of Israel was passing on by, a woman cried to him, "Help me, my lord the king!" And the king replied, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor? From the winepress?" Then he asked her, "What's the matter?" She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son, so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son, so we may eat him,' but she had hidden him." When the king heard the woman's words, he tore his robes. As he went along the wall, the people looked, and they saw that under his robes he had sackcloth on his body. And he said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. And the king sent a messenger ahead, but before he arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Don't you see how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it shut against him. Is not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him?" Now while he was still talking to them, the messenger came down to them. And the king said, This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Yeah, because trying to do things your way after God's made you wait for a while usually does not end up pretty well. I'll tell you that much. Anyways, so that was chapter 6. Chapter 6 is basically like, it has a couple of short miracle stories of like Elisha somehow making iron float, which for those of you who know, anything about metals and water, most metals don't float. So yeah, it's just one of those cases where like, yeah, something unnatural in the world of physics occurs, right? Which is, nothing short of a miracle. Even though it doesn't seem like it's a big deal, it's like, oh, you just make some iron float. But sure, right? And Elisha does it to help this poor soul who's like, "Oh crap, this axe was borrowed. I can't have it broken." And that's an honorable thing, right? You don't want to break stuff that you borrow. You want to be a good steward of stuff that's lent to you. And so Elisha has like compassion on him, right? Excuse me. Oh, I wish this would go away. But anyway, then we have the crazy story of the chapter. A lot of people remember this part of the chapter. All the people in church anyway, where like Elisha's gonna be attacked by the troops of Aram. And which is funny because like, wasn't Aram the same place where like Naaman was from? Wouldn't like these guys know to just like leave Israel alone after like, well, I guess Naaman wasn't as well respected as people thought he was, right? Because I mean, the Arameans are still up to their raiding the Israelites kind of thing, right? But then Elisha's like, "Yeah, we're not having that." And so he has God magically blind everybody, or at least like deceive their eyes, Because I don't know if it like it's one of those things where like while the Bible uses the word like blind, I don't think it means like a literal like cannot see anything because it'd be hard to lead an entire army when none of them can see anything. But I think it's more like probably like an illusion kind of thing. So like these guys were looking for Elisha. Elisha straight up walks up to them, but then like their eyes couldn't see that it was Elisha. They might have had like an illusion where they thought it was someone else that's like, okay, this person's gonna lead us to where we need to be. And then like they don't know that they end up in like, you know, Samaria's front door, right? And so and then of course like then Elisha undoes the illusion and is like, oh yeah, so like you guys are all kind of like trapped now. But we're not just gonna slaughter you even though we could, right? Excuse me. Because and that's the funny thing too. The funny thing about this story, or these stories rather, is that like, okay, so we have the Aram guys, and Elisha just helped them last chapter. Here we have Elisha help out the Israelites by basically trapping these Arameans, and then letting by sparing the Arameans stop their raids against Israel, which is a huge boon for Israel, right? Because that means they can kind of, live in relative peace as opposed to worrying about all these raiding parties, right? But then you get to the last part of the chapter where like this famine strikes Israel, and it gets so bad to the point that like people are resorting to cannibalism. That's how bad it gets. Well, it's not just a famine, right? Because who was attacking again? Let me read that. Well, it was Aram again. So, because Aram is they're like a longtime enemy of like Israel, right? And so Aram causes this famine, which I mean it kind of just shows that like people are kind of dicks to each other, right? Because you know after Elisha has he tries to set up peace between Aram and Israel. That's fundamentally what he was doing. That peace treaty doesn't last for very long, and so the people of Aram are like, yeah, we're gonna attack Israel again, probably in like some time later, maybe a year or something. Bible's not particularly clear of the time space, but sometime later, Aram is all mobilized and excuse me, they end up trapping Israel within their own walls to the point that like there's no food because once you trap them in their city, right? And actually, this was a common way for people to actually win battles. You just when you besiege a city, you don't actually do the heroes of might magic thing, right? Where you like use your catapult and break the walls, right? That's not usually what that's usually not what people do. Of course, in Heroes of Might and Magic, everything happens in like 1 day spans, right? That's how turns work in that game. But in real life and in the ancient world, what they would do was they would just surround the place and then they would just wait it out. Like that's how you would beat someone in a siege battle normally. You just like surround them. You cut off all like their exits and entrances. So by doing that, you get rid of like any trade routes and stuff like that. No food and stuff coming to help. And if Israel runs out of food and stuff, right? The general idea when you do this is that you force the people who are besieged to surrender, right? They're like, okay, we don't want to die in these walls. We don't just want to rot in here. We'll surrender to you, right? And we'll answer your demands. And there are other times we read through the Book of Kings that this happens a couple of times, right? Where they tried this strategy, and other people have tried the strategy on Israel. But in those other cases, we read one such case in like First Kings, right, where one of the other king, I think it was the Ammonites or something, who knows, they were besieging Judah, and they tried this strategy, and then Judah was like, the people in the city were like, let's call to our allies in Jerusalem, right, and then the enemy lets them do it, and doesn't just starve them out, and then of course Jerusalem ends up coming to their aid and saving them, right. But here in this story, that doesn't happen. The king of Aram's not having any of that. He's just like, no, we're just gonna wait these guys out, and his plan starts to work, right? Because then the Bible tells us how bad the inflation gets, right? They're selling like donkey heads, which is like a worthless part of the animal, really. Because what can you really eat from a donkey's head anyway? I mean, that's what they were using it for, obviously, right? But they would sell this like pretty useless part of an animal to eat for like what 80 shekels of silver, so like a couple of silver coins for like something that's relatively worthless, right? And then of course there's the scarier part of the story where these like people are starting to resort to cannibalism, and we get the story of like these women who eat like their children, right? Or they make this plan to like, eat each other's like children. It's really messed up, right? And so that's how bad it gets. And of course the king doesn't take to it very well, and instead of praying to God and asking him to like send a miracle to help them out. Oh, now you have to hear that sound. I'll just wait for it. Yeah, I think the sound is gone. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so instead of like praying, the king of Israel could have been praying and like ask God for a miracle or something. Instead, he just like curses God essentially, but he's like, well, it's Elisha's fault. And by doing that, by saying that, like, well, if it's Elisha's fault, then by extension, it's God's fault, right? Because Elisha's just doing the will of God. And so he blames Elisha. He's like, all right, we got to kill Elisha. That's the answer to this problem, right? Not, maybe come up with a strategy of how to deal with your besiegers. No, it's like kill this one guy who's, in the grand scheme of things, is just like a guy, right? Like, Elisha's no, he's not really anything special in that sense, right? He's just some guy. And so, but that's the king's answer, right? Like, let's kill this guy, and that will fix our problems. Because of course, like, you know, what these guys, what the king thinks is probably that, like, well, it it's this guy and whatever curses he's spouting out, as opposed to like being more introspective and be like, okay, maybe I'm doing something wrong here, and that's what's led us to this problem, right? And of course, it's one of those things where like I know it's one of those things about the Bible that makes people uncomfortable, where it's like where things go wrong. People don't want to think, well, where did I make the mistake? Or, well, the Bible's language is like, what sins have I committed to lead me to the problems I have now? But instead, the modern person tends to be like, well, it's obviously someone else's fault, right? Which is not a new concept, because obviously, the king of Israel is doing that here, right? He's not being introspective and thinking like, what sins have I committed to make God allow this to happen? Instead, his response is, no, it's Elisha's fault. We should just kill that guy, right? So, which sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but at the same time, you know, if people were more introspective, they would realize that like a lot of people probably think like this, the king does, and always thinks all the bad things is someone else's fault, as opposed to like maybe it's something you're doing wrong, right? Maybe it's your inaction, or maybe it's your, you know, your unwillingness to come up with a plan to help yourself, right? Maybe that's the problem, as opposed to like saying it's someone else's fault. But it is always easier to say it's someone else's fault, even if it's untrue. And then, of course, the chapter 6 ends with like, okay, it goes to Elisha, and he's just like, yeah, I know somebody's gonna come here and try and kill me. It's only a matter of when someone's gonna try it, right? But I mean, we just read that like Elisha was able to, with the help of God, deter, an army from Aram, right? I'm pretty sure he can handle a couple of like messengers from the king of Israel, right? We'll find out in chapter 7. So Elisha replied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Now the officer whose arm the king was leaning on said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heaven, could this happen?" "You will see it with your own eyes," answered Elisha, "but you will not eat any of it." Now there were 4 guys with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. And they said to each other, "Why should we stay here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we'll die. And if we stay here, we will also die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we'll die." So at dusk they got up and went to the camp of the Arameans. And when they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there. For the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the shouts of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, "Well, look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittites and the Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned they abandoned their tents, their horses, and their donkeys. They left the camp as if it was a run for their lives. Now the men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp and entered one of the tents, and there they ate and drank. They then took silver, gold, and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent and took some things from it and hid them also. Then they said to each other, What we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let us go at once and report this to the royal palace." So they went and called out to the city gatekeepers and told them, "We went into the Aramean camp, and no one was there, not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents left just as they were." The gatekeepers shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. The king got up in the night and said to his officers, "I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know we are starving, so they have left the camp to hide in the countryside, thinking, 'They will surely come out, and then we will take them alive and get into the city.'" And one of his officers answered, "Have some men take 5 of the horses and then leave them in the city." their plight will be like that and all the Israelites left here. Yet there will only be like those Israelites who are doomed. So let us send them to find out what happened. So they searched 2 chariots with their horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army. He commanded the drivers, "Go out and find out what has happened." They followed them as far as the Jordan, and they found the whole road strewn with the clothing and equipment the Arameans had thrown away in their headlong flight. So the messengers returned and reported to the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a seah of the finest flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel. As the Lord had said, now the king had put the officer on whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died, just as the man of God had foretold when the king came down to his house. It happened as the man of God had said to the king, about this time tomorrow, a seah of finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. The officer had said to the man of God, "Oh, look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heaven, could this happen?" The man of God replied, "You will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it." And that is exactly what happened to him. For the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died. Alright, so chapter 7. Pretty short chapter, pretty straightforward, right? So, not really a lot to say here. Just one of those, like, miracle moments. You know, God makes something happen. You don't really see much of it, because it's like, all the Bible tells you is that, like, okay, so God just confused the Arameans, making them think that, like, they were hearing stuff. You know, they were hearing, like, an army of horsemen coming. And they thought that, like, oh crap, we're so wasted. We better get out of here. And so, the Arameans just, like, run for it. That's it, right? That's the miracle in a nutshell. And so, nothing too spectacular in this scene. But, you know, God provides for the Israelites. And one of the things that's interesting, the only real interesting to point out is just the contrast of, like, you know, the plentiful that they'll have after the Arameans run away, right? Because we read in the last chapter where, like, the Israelites would buy a donkey's head for, like, what, 80 shekels of silver or whatever it was? Which is, like, way overpriced for something that's, like, essentially the useless part of the donkey, right? Because, I mean, I assume that they would buy the donkey's head to eat it. But, you know, you wouldn't find a lot of good meat on a donkey's head. Would you really want to eat that thing, right? And so, but at the same time, people were so desperate for food, they would pay a lot of money for a pretty worthless thing to eat, right? And of course, there was the whole cannibalism thing. But then, you know, in this later part, it's like, well, people will be able to buy fine flour for a single shekel. Like, that's a huge difference, right? 85 shekels for something worthless versus, like, you know, fine flour for a single shekel, right? Like, it's a huge contrast, but basically the idea is to point out that, like, you know, the plentiful God provided in this case, you know, by using the Arameans and essentially the Arameans, you know, and this is the piece of irony, right? As I pointed out, you know, the Aramean war strategy, which is what caused, you know, the Israelites to resort to cannibalism, was like, well, we'll just surround them, take the trade routes, and then, like, starve them out. But then, of course, by doing that, they had provided, you know, probably lots of merchant trade that they probably would have taken on the road to getting to Samaria and all that. And, you know, the Arameans end up being like the people who brought the goods as opposed to blocking off the goods, right? It's kind of ironic. Of course, one of the funny things in the story is that the story begins with, like, these 4 random guys with, like, leprosy. And it's funny because like God just has them like just do like whatever thing they needed to survive, and it's they who find the miracle, right? Say, okay, let's just like maybe we'll surrender to the Arameans because like the guys with leprosy would be aware that like well we're basically outcasts from our own home because of course once again nobody wants to really be around people with flesh eating diseases, so they were basically outcasts from their own home. So they're like, you know what? Let's just go surrender to the Arameans and maybe, just maybe, they'll spare us, right? But it's because of this kind of like, I don't want to say bravery. It's not exactly brave what they did, but at the same time, it's like, they didn't just, they weren't hopeless, right? They didn't just, they tried whatever option, right? And, that's admirable in its own way. It's just like, let's just do whatever we can to survive. Let's surrender to the enemy, the big plan that the Aramean army was doing with the whole surrounding the town kind of thing. And yet it's these four guys with leprosy, which makes you think about how like, for Israel to try and hold out as long as they did, like they held out for quite a while. You have to have held out long enough to resort to cannibalism. And it just shows that like Israel was just so stubborn, right? They were like unwilling to like surrender, take the route that would save more people. But instead, we get these four guys with leprosy that are just like, okay, we're gonna take the surrender route. But then it ends up being that like, well, God provided for everyone in the city except for that one guy who gets trampled, because there's always the one guy who gets totally screwed. But to be fair, like Elisha was just like, well, because you served it, you were gonna do evil for this for the name of your king. Well, you will be, there will be retribution upon you, and I mean that's gotta be like the worst. That's gotta be a terrible way to go, right? It's just like you're sitting at you're on guard at the castle gate, and like just like hundreds if not thousands of people, because now there's food, right? They're just like running amok, getting all this food that they now have plentiful of, and then they just like run this guy over, and he gets like trampled underneath them, right? And that's mega oof right there. But yeah, that's all there really is to say about that chapter. Not much really goes on here, right? Nothing out of the ordinary. Just a interesting story of like God provides for the people, and there's obviously quite a few ironic senses that happens between a bunch of lepers finding the goods, the Arameans being providers to the Israelites despite the whole plan of like cut off any like providers. It's ironic, but if you learn anything from this chapter, the Bible loves the play on irony, right? And if you learn anything from this channel, it's kind of like I like to point out those ironic moments because it shows that God does have some sense of humor, right? Everything is gonna be ironic because it'd be no fun if everything just went out, the normal way, right? Okay. With that said, we're gonna move on to chapter 8, which will be the last chapter we read for today. I know it's gonna be a shorter stream, but as you can tell, like I'm already fading. Like I'm pretty tired, and so, but at the same time, it's like okay, I should still do a reading stream because the problem is that like okay, if you work on Fridays, and then it's like if I wanted to like stream when I was more like awake, then it would never happen, right? It would never happen because then like it's one of those things like when you gotta work as much as I do. It's like it's hard to find time to like it's hard to get enough rest, right? So sometimes if you can't get the rest, you just gotta power through and even do your reading streams while like half asleep. But with that said, we're gonna finish chapter 8, and then we'll do our regular housekeeping and stuff like that, and that'll be the end of the stream. So here we go, chapter 8. Now Elisha said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, a couple chapters ago, go away with your family and stay for a while, wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years. The woman proceeded to do as the man of God said. She and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, she came back from the land of the Philistines and went to appeal to the king for her house and land. The king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and said, "Tell me about all the great things Elisha has done." Just as Gehazi was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, the woman whose son Elisha had brought back to life came to appeal to the king for her house and land. And Gehazi said, "This is the woman, my lord the king, and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life." And the king asked the woman about it, and she told him. Then he assigned an official to her case and said to him, "Give back everything that belonged to her, including all the income from her land from the day she left the country until now." Now Elisha went to Damascus. Elisha went to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, was ill. When the king was told, "The man of God has come all the way up here," he said to Hazael, "Take a gift with you and go meet the man of God. Consult the Lord through him and ask, will I recover from this illness?" So Hazael went to Elisha, taking with him a gift of 40 camel loads of all the finest wares of Damascus. He went in and stood before him and said, "Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to ask, will I recover from this illness?" Elisha answered, "Go and say to him, you will certainly recover. Nonetheless, the Lord has revealed to me that he will in fact die." He stared at him with a fixed gaze until Hazael was embarrassed. Then the man of God began to weep. "Why is my Lord weeping?" said Hazael. "Because I know the harm you will do to Israel," he answered. "You will set fire to the fortified places, kill their young men, and with the sword dash their little children to the ground, and rip open their pregnant women." And Hazael said, "How could your servant, a mere dog, accomplish such a feat?" "The Lord has shown me that you will become king of Aram," answered Elisha. Then Hazael left Elisha and returned to his master. When Ben-Hadad asked, What did Elisha tell you?" And Hazael replied, "He told me that you would certainly recover." But the next day he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and spread it over the king's face, so that he died. Then Hazael succeeded him as king. Now in the 5th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, when Jehoshaphat was king of Judah, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, began his reign as the king of Judah. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 8 years. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for he married a daughter of Ahab. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Nevertheless, for the sake of his servant David, the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah. He had promised to maintain a lamp for David and his descendants forever. Now in the time of Jehoram, Edom rebelled against Judah and set up its own king. So Jehoram went to Zer with all his chariots. The Edomites surrounded him and his commanding officers, but he rose up and broke through by night his army. However, he fled back home. Now to this day, Edom had been in rebellion against Judah, and Libnah rebelled at the same time. So as for the other events of Jehoram's reign and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoram rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, and Ahaziah, his son, succeeded him as king. Now in the 12th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 1 year. That's it. His mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of Omri, the king of Israel. Verse 27. He followed the ways of the house of Ahab and did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was related by marriage to Ahab's family. Ahaziah went with Joram, son of Ahab, to war against Hazael, the king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead. The Arameans wounded Joram, so King Joram returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds the Arameans had inflicted on him. Then Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to Jezreel to see Joram, the son of Ahab, because he had been wounded. That's chapter 8. So chapter 8 is pretty straightforward. Basically, we have the story of a new king in Aram and how he gets to be king, and as well as funny things where like Aram is pretty like nasty too, right? Where like it's all this like almost Game of Thrones style, you know, like all this backstabbing treachery, right? Where it's like Elisha, as well as, and of course the funny thing about this Bible story too, with like Elisha and Hazael, it's kind of like the whole like chicken or egg thing, right? Because did Hazael get the idea from Elisha's prophecy, or was Elijah's prophecy really like he already knew what was going to happen, and basically by extension was Hazael already going to do this, right? You know, this betrayal of Ben-Hadad, you know, usurp the crown by killing him and then become king himself, right? And then Hazael becomes king. And so it's one of those funny things because there's a little bit of a bootstrap paradox with that, right? Because once on the one hand, once again, you know, Elisha is claiming that like, well, he knows he's going to do it. But then at the same time, does Hazael get the idea when he hears this revelation, right? So which is it, right? Is it the chicken or the egg kind of thing? And it's one of those weird things. And yes, it just gets annoying to read stuff like that. I mean, in fiction in general, and the Bible only more so, where it's like, oh, yay, or like chicken or egg paradox kind of stuff that happens. So, I mean, what do you think, right? Do you think, like, did Hazael always have the idea to betray the king and then become king himself? Or did Elisha, in fact, actually give him the idea to do it? Even though Elisha was quote unquote crying because he had already seen what would happen. And so it's kind of interesting that like you find these kind of literature motifs, you know, even in places like a story about Elisha answering a simple question, right? Will the king recover? Well, he will, but he's still going to die because you're going to kill him, basically, is what Elisha was hinting at, right? And it's funny that, like, that's where a lot of people actually don't. I remember that, like, reading that story as a kid, it's like, that's such a weird thing for him to say, but then I didn't really understand the paradox as well. because you know when you're a younger person reading these things and you don't put like the science fiction-y elements in as much as you should, then the story doesn't make as much sense. But then like you read it and then you've put all those like science fiction elements in it, and it actually makes more sense, right? So it's like, yeah, there's the bootstrap paradox in this scene. If you're wondering why it's like Elisha says it that way, it's it's yeah, he kind of entertains that like Schrodinger's cat thing too, right? Like it's both, right? Which only makes it more complicated, right? Like, oh, it's like it's one of those things where like why knowing the future would actually be like a terrible thing, right? Because then like you're stuck with those paradoxes all the time. It's like, okay, did this happen because of like it's gonna happen, or me knowing it will cause it to happen, or me saying anything about it will cause it to happen, right? And there's no real answer to that, right? Because it's not like the Bible cares to answer that. It's not like any science fiction story cares to answer that question, right? It's just kind of the way it is, and it's a weird story mechanic, but you find it here in the Bible too, right? And then, of course, after Hazael becomes the king, the Bible just goes back to more like genealogy stories and just telling like, okay, when these guys were kings, this guy was king for this long and that king was king for that long and whatever, right? But of course, there's this buildup of like Hazael becomes like the major threat now. And so, of course, like the earlier part of chapter 8 was kind of telling you how Hazael even came to be, right? Which is funny because, this threat of Israel, God has, once again, that's why the paradox thing is so important to talk about and to think about in this chapter, right? This weird bootstrap paradox. Because Elisha has a direct connection to an extent of this battle between Israel and Judah versus another foreign enemy, in this case Aram, and of course Hazael, the king of Aram, at this point. And so there's these little interesting tidbits where like even though Israel and Judah tend to leave each other alone, they will have these moments where they team up, they make these little alliances to try and fight these foreign groups. And it's interesting that like, yeah, we see that again here, right? And so, but in this case, the little twist was that like Hazael and his interaction with Elisha, right? And it's just a very weird thing that like the Bible adds a little, nuance. And of course it begs the question of like, is Elisha partly responsible? And by extension, would that go back to the whole like, I mean, on the one hand, the obvious answer is that like, okay, God ordains everything. But like, did God ordain and orchestrate this event specifically for Israel and Judah to have this alliance against Hazael and Aram? And so it's just a weird thing to think about, and that's why the paradox thing is weird too, to like think about in the story, because it does bring up the question of how much. And I know some people would say like, well, doesn't that make God kind of douchey for like essentially orchestrating this war between Israel and Judah versus Aram, right? Because I mean, the last set of chapters we've been reading is all about like fights, but little skirmishes, quote unquote skirmishes, between Aram and then of course Israel, right? And then now Judah is getting involved. So of course, once Judah gets involved, things will start escalating. But at the same time, the interesting thing is that by doing the genealogy bits and talking about like these kings, like a couple kings in Judah and a king in Israel, it's kind of painting that like, okay, will God use Aram to punish Israel and Judah? Because that's kind of what's implied, right? Because with Israel and Judah, they've been pretty bad as of late, right? Bad kings following Ahab and his bad example. Even though Ahab's been dead for a while, right? Ahab died when we were reading, the early parts of Second Kings last week, right? And Ahab, we remember him, right? He's a pretty bad guy. And so we'll see. you know, what happens, right? Will they defeat Hazael, right? Even though Hazael is like the one who actually confronts a man of God, right? And so maybe God will give Hazael the advantage. We don't know, right? At least, when you're reading it up to this point. I mean, I know what happens next because, you just keep reading and then you know what happens. But it's just one of those funny things where, like, how the picture that's painted, right, before us, right? Because, you think of like Israel and Judah as supposed to be like God's covenant people. But yet now we have an enemy who appears to have more favor from God because, Aram isn't ran by a bunch of idol worshiping, God forsakers, right? And so the interesting question is, will God then forsake Israel, right? That's the question that's kind of brought up with the telling of chapter 8 and how it's laid out this way. So yeah, that's basically chapter 8 in a nutshell. So I have read up all the chapters I was planning to read today, which means we're probably going to end the stream pretty soon. I'll leave the chat open for a couple of questions if of any of the stuff I've read, or any comments, and I'll read them out. But I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we end the stream. So for next week, we're just going to have our 3 regular videos. The first one being, our podcast on Monday. The podcast will be at 4 o'clock Pacific time. Then we'll have our Throwback Thursday, and yes, I still have to figure out how I'm going to RNG abuse. Let's be real, I'm going to RNG abuse, that epic battle. Because if you watch yesterday's video, you should definitely check out, Throwback Thursdays, Heroes of Might Magic 2, The Price of Loyalty. You would know I got totally boned at the end of that map, or at the end of yesterday's video. I got boned pretty hard. So I'm like trying to solve some RNG stuff to like how to beat it, as opposed to like replaying the whole map, because that would suck if I had to replay the whole map. But I'm gonna try and figure out some RNG stuff. If I can't, then I might just replay the whole map and then like scum up to that point or whatever. And then, of course, with that said, that video of whatever I find, whatever solution I come up with, that will be next Thursday's Throwback Thursday video of Heroes of Might Magic 2. And then, of course, we'll continue on with the Book of 2 Kings, starting with chapter 9 next Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. I'll try to be more on time, but it's not easy when you like get home from work and the first thing you want to do is actually nap. But it's like, oh wait, I have to stream. So, but next Friday, 3 o'clock, we're gonna continue on, and you'll see what happens between Israel and Judah versus Aram. So, with that said, that's it for announcements. That's it for what's going to go down for next week. Hope you guys enjoyed this Bible reading stream. Don't forget, if you guys ever have questions, you can, send me a DM on Discord or whatever as well. And of course, leave questions on YouTube and whatever. Don't hesitate to ask questions. But anyway, this is going to be the end of the video. Or the stream, I guess. And I will see you guys on Monday for the next podcast. I hope you guys have a great Friday. I hope you guys have a great weekend, Halloween included. Happy Halloween. All right, you guys have a great Halloween weekend. And I will see you guys on All Saints Day. God bless you, and good night.